Little girl found a German shepherd locked in a cage. What happened next made all cry. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a moment in time that will stay with you forever. A moment that tested the strength of a child, the loyalty of a dog, and the fragile line between tragedy and triumph. This isn't fiction. It happened. And it might just change the way you see the world. Like, share, and let us know where you're watching from, because this story deserves to be heard. The storm had rolled in faster than anyone expected. Dark clouds smothered the sky above the little town of Willow Brook, and thunder cracked so sharply it made the windows of old wooden houses rattle in their frames. Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against tin rooftops, spilling into gutters, turning dirt paths into muddy streams. Most families had already retreated indoors, closing their curtains, switching on the glow of lamps, and waiting for the storm to pass. But not everyone was safe inside. In a small house at the edge of town, 4-year-old Lily pressed her face against the rain-streaked window, her little hands leaving prints on the fogged glass. Her blue dress, slightly wrinkled, her favorite, clung damply to her as she had just come in from the porch, refusing to leave until the last possible second. She was known in the neighborhood for her gentle heart. Even at her young age, she had a habit of leaving crumbs for the birds, carrying water for stray cats, and picking flowers just to hand them to anyone who looked sad. To her, kindness wasn't something to be taught. It was simply the only way she knew how to live. As lightning flashed across the sky, Lily tilted her head. Beneath the roar of the rain and the rolling thunder, she thought she heard something. At first it was faint, almost hidden, like a secret tucked inside the storm. A cry. Not a human voice, but something rawer, more desperate. She pressed her ear closer to the window, straining. There it was again. A bark. No, not even a bark. More of a weak, broken whimper. Her small heart raced. She knew the sound of joy in a dog's bark, the way it rang playful and full of life. This was different. This was pain. A cry for help. "Grandpa," she whispered, but her voice was swallowed by the thunder. No one heard her. Without waiting for the comfort of an answer, Lily tugged on her rain boots and pushed open the screen door. The wind nearly knocked her back, but her determination carried her forward. She darted into the yard, her little feet splashing through puddles. The storm tugged at her dress, her hair plastered to her cheeks, but she kept moving, guided only by the fragile sound she couldn't ignore. She followed it past the fence line, across the edge of an abandoned field where weeds grew tall and wild. Lightning lit up the night for a heartbeat, and in that brief illumination, Lily saw it, half hidden behind tangled brush, nearly swallowed by mud. A cage. Her tiny breath caught. Inside, a German shepherd lay crumpled against the rusting bars. Its fur, matted with rain and dirt, clung to its gaunt body. Its sides rose and fell with shallow effort, every breath a battle. The dog's eyes flickered open for a moment, and in that fleeting glance, Lily felt something pierce her soul. There was pain there, yes, but also pleading. A silent cry, begging not to be left alone. She stumbled closer, the storm soaking her through, her little hands reaching instinctively for the bars. "Oh, doggy," she whispered, her voice trembling with innocence. The shepherd stirred weakly, pressing its nose against the iron. A whimper escaped, softer than the rain. Behind her, houses glowed with warm yellow light. Adults stayed inside, waiting out the storm. To them, this was just another night of bad weather. But to Lily, this was the moment that would change everything. The rain hammered harder, thunder rolled above, and the weeds bent low as if bowing to the scene. A child, too small for the world's cruelties, standing before a cage that held not just an animal, but a story waiting to be freed. What happened next would make an entire town cry. The town of Willow Brook had always carried the quiet charm of an old photograph, white painted fences, a church bell that rang every Sunday, the smell of fresh pies cooling on windowsills. For the older folks, it was a place where time seemed to walk slower, where every corner reminded them of something familiar. A baseball game played in the park long ago, the way the streets looked after the county fair, the hum of a radio drifting out from a porch on summer nights. Yet beneath this peaceful skin, there were corners the town had stopped noticing, forgotten places that no one visited anymore. It was in one of those corners that the story truly began. Inside a weather-beaten farmhouse at the edge of town, 4-year-old Lily sat at the kitchen table. The smell of fried eggs and biscuits filled the air, but her little plate lay untouched. She swung her legs slowly, lost in her thoughts, her chin resting on the table's edge. Her grandmother, Martha, fussed at the stove while her grandfather, Jack Harper, poured black coffee into a chipped mug. They had raised children once already, but life had handed them this second round. Lily's parents had struggled with responsibilities, with choices, with battles no one spoke of out loud, and so the little girl had come here, to her grandparents' home, to be raised in steadier hands. Jack, with his weathered face and silver hair, looked out the window at the fields. "Ground still soggy from the storm," he muttered. "Best stay close today." The night before had brought a downpour so fierce it rattled windows and flooded ditches, and the morning sun had revealed a town dripping with water. But Lily wasn't listening to talk of puddles and fields. Her eyes kept wandering to the glass, as though something out there still called her. She was a child made of kindness, the kind everyone in town seemed to notice. She carried birdseed in her pockets and left crumbs for sparrows. She whispered to stray cats as if they were old friends. Even the neighbor's surly dog, who snapped at everyone else, would sit quietly when she walked by. "Animals trust you, Lily," Martha always said, shaking her head with wonder. "You've got a gift." That morning, after pretending to nibble at her toast, Lily slipped outside in her little blue dress and rubber boots. The air was sharp and damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth. She padded to the back porch, scooped crumbs into the tin bowl, and set it beneath the oak tree. Soon the sparrows came, chirping hungrily. Lily smiled faintly, but her heart was tugged elsewhere. Past the garden, past the crooked swing that swayed in the wind, past the shed leaning against years of weather. Her small feet carried her toward the fence line, to the edge of the old field. That field was no one's anymore. The man who once farmed it had died, and since then weeds had taken over. Brambles grew in thick knots, swallowing rusted tools and broken posts. Children were told not to wander there. It was too wild, too forgotten. But Lily moved toward it with quiet purpose, her boots sinking into the soft ground. She didn't know why, not fully. She only knew she had heard something in the storm last night, a faint cry that had burrowed into her little heart. The further she went, the quieter it became. The chatter of sparrows faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through long weeds. The field seemed to hold its breath as though waiting for her. She pushed through the tall grass until, at last, she saw it. A cage. It was half hidden in the corner of the field where the weeds grew tallest. The metal bars were orange with rust, one corner sunk into the mud as if the earth itself wanted to swallow it whole. At first glance, it might have looked like a piece of junk abandoned years ago. But Lily froze, her breath caught in her throat, because inside the cage lay something that no one else had cared to notice. A German shepherd. The dog was curled in on itself, sides rising and falling with shallow effort. His fur was matted and filthy, clumped with mud and streaked with scars. His paws were raw, his ribs faintly visible beneath the wet coat. The storm had soaked him completely, and now he trembled in the chill of morning. He did not bark. He did not growl. Instead, as Lily drew near, he raised his head just slightly and looked at her. Those eyes, dark, pleading, almost human in their sorrow, locked onto hers. It was as if all the pain of being forgotten, of being left in the rain and mud, lived in that single gaze. Lily's knees sank into the wet grass before she even realized she'd moved. Her tiny hands clutched the cold bars. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I see you." The dog whimpered softly, pressing his nose against the iron. It wasn't the sound of anger or warning. It was the sound of a soul begging not to be alone. Lily slid her fingers through the rusted gap, touching the damp fur. The shepherd closed his eyes, leaning into her hand with what little strength he had. The cage itself was cruelly small, barely enough room for him to shift. The lock on the door was thick, old, and unyielding. Whoever had left him here hadn't intended for him to leave. It was a place built for silence, for neglect, for something to be forgotten. And yet here was Lily, a child too innocent to look away, kneeling in the mud as rainwater soaked her dress, whispering to a dog no one else had heard. The world beyond the field went on as always. Adults hurried about their chores, neighbors chatted over fences, curtains glowed warm with morning light. To them, this corner was nothing but weeds and waste. But to a little girl in a blue dress, it was the beginning of something much larger. She pressed her hand firmer against the bars, her breath quickening. She couldn't explain it, not in words big enough for grown-ups, but she felt it. This wasn't just a dog. This was a life waiting to be saved, a cry waiting for someone small enough to listen. The forgotten corner of Willow Brook had been silent for years. Now, because of one child's compassion, it would never be silent again. The storm had left the town drenched, and though the heavy rain had eased, the sky still hung low and dark, as if unwilling to let go of its anger. Inside the farmhouse, Jack tried to busy himself with repairing the porch shutter that the wind had torn loose, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of small, hurried footsteps splashing through the puddles. Lily came rushing toward him, her little boots soaked, her hair plastered to her forehead, and her eyes wide with urgency. She tugged hard at his sleeve, pointing toward the field with all the force her tiny body could muster. "Grandpa," she gasped out of breath, "what is stuck?" Jack straightened slowly, his brow furrowed. He had raised animals for years and knew strays often wandered around after storms, but the panic in her voice was not the kind that children invented during games. He crouched to meet her eyes, speaking carefully. "A dog? Out there? What cage?" Lily's head bobbed in a fierce nod, her little fingers gripping his calloused hand tightly. "We have to help. He's crying." Martha had stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a towel, watching the scene unfold. Jack felt the weight of his granddaughter's words, but the years of experience made him cautious. He had seen strays turn vicious when cornered. "Sweet pea," he said firmly, "strays can be dangerous. You don't just run to them." But Lily shook her head with surprising certainty. "Not dangerous. Sad." The way she said it made his heart catch. Jack looked at Martha, who stood silently, her eyes soft with worry. "Her heart's too big," she murmured. Jack exhaled, half in frustration and half in surrender. "A heart too big can get hurt," he muttered, but when Lily's small hand pulled again, trembling with urgency, he relented. He grabbed the flashlight from the hook by the door and nodded. "Show me then." They walked through the wet grass toward the forgotten field, Lily leading the way with determination far beyond her years. The mud clung to Jack's boots, but Lily pressed forward, her little blue dress streaked with rain and soil. When they reached the corner where weeds grew tallest, Jack stopped short. There it was, a rusted cage half hidden among the brush, a cage no one had touched in years. And inside, crumpled against the iron bars, lay a German shepherd. The sight struck him like a blow. The dog's fur was filthy, clumped with mud, its paws swollen and raw. Its ribs showed faintly beneath the coat, and its breathing was shallow, almost ragged. When the flashlight beam found him, he lifted his head just enough for Jack to see those eyes, dark, pleading, filled with a sorrow that seemed almost human. Jack's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Lily gently by the shoulder, pulling her back. "Stay away from the bars," he warned. "He's scared. That's when dogs bite." But Lily slipped from his grasp and fell to her knees in the wet grass. Without hesitation, she reached for the cage. "Doggy," she whispered softly, her little fingers curling around the cold bars. "It's okay. I'm here." Jack's heart pounded as he reached forward to pull her away, but before he could, the shepherd moved. Slowly, painfully, the dog pushed its muzzle against the bars. Lily slipped her tiny hand through the gap, and Jack braced himself for the snap of jaws. Instead, the dog's tongue brushed against her knuckles with the gentlest of touches. The child smiled through the rain, her voice barely audible. "See? Not bad. Just lonely." For a long moment, Jack was frozen. His mind screamed at him about rabies, about bites, about scars he had seen on others who had been too trusting. But his heart, his tired old heart, felt something different. He saw his granddaughter's small hand cradling the suffering animal's muzzle, the dog leaning into her touch as though she was the first kindness it had ever known. Something about that moment silenced all his arguments. Thunder cracked overhead, jolting him back to the urgency of the situation. He set the flashlight down, tested the cage door, and found it secured with a heavy lock. Rust covered the metal, the years sealing it shut. He pulled hard, his muscles straining, but it did not give. "It's no use," he muttered under his breath. "This thing hasn't been opened in decades." But Lily refused to let go of the bars. She pressed her face close, whispering softly to the shepherd, her words nearly lost in the rain. "We'll help you. We'll get you out. Don't be scared." The dog whimpered again, pressing closer, his tail giving the faintest twitch of hope. Jack's jaw tightened. He watched his granddaughter kneeling there in the mud, her blue dress soaked through, her little hands trembling with determination, and he thought of all the times adults had walked past suffering with excuses, too busy, too cautious, too hardened. He remembered the lessons life had beaten into him, the warnings and the fears that came with age, and how often children saw past them to truths adults forgot. That sometimes it wasn't about safety or reason, but about compassion. Sometimes the smallest hearts understood the greatest responsibilities. He placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, his voice heavy but gentler now. "All right, sweet pea," he said, his throat thick with emotion. "We'll get him out. I promise." The storm rumbled again, louder, the rain falling harder, but Jack no longer hesitated. He grabbed the lock with both hands, twisting, pulling, fighting against the rust. His muscles burned, his fingers slipping on the wet iron, but he did not stop. The shepherd whined louder, sensing freedom was near. Lily pressed her cheek against the bars, whispering, "Hold on, we're here." And as Jack fought with the cage, he realized it wasn't just the dog who needed saving. It was something in all of them, the child who refused to give up, the old man who remembered what it felt like to hope, and the forgotten creature who only needed someone to care. The storm had grown angrier again, the sky splitting open with sharp cracks of thunder that rolled across the fields. Sheets of rain poured down, washing the earth into thick rivers of mud that pulled at every step. Jack returned from the shed, panting, carrying a crowbar in one hand and a pair of old bolt cutters in the other. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his clothes already soaked, and yet the fire in his granddaughter's eyes left him no choice but to push on. Lily stood firm beside the cage, holding the flashlight in her trembling hands, its narrow beam cutting through the curtain of rain. Her little blue dress clung to her skin, her boots sunk deep into the mud, but her gaze never wavered from the creature inside. The German shepherd had begun to howl, a low, pained sound that rose above the storm, a sound so raw it made the hair stand on Jack's neck. Each howl was broken by fits of coughing, as if the water splashing up from the rising ditch was filling his lungs. The cage had shifted in the softened ground, one corner sinking deeper into the mud, tilting dangerously toward the water rushing nearby. Every second counted. Jack dropped to his knees in front of the lock, mud splattering his shirt. "Hold that light steady, Lily," he barked, his voice tight with urgency. She nodded quickly, her hands clutching the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. The beam danced over the padlock, rust-eaten but stubbornly solid. Jack tried the crowbar first, wedging it under the loop and heaving with all his strength. The metal groaned but did not give. Rainwater streamed down his face, dripping into his eyes, but he only wiped it away with the back of his sleeve and pushed harder. The shepherd cried out, a sharp yelp of agony, his paws scraping frantically at the bars as the cage sank another inch into the muck. Lily whimpered at the sound, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "Please, Grandpa, hurry," she cried, her small voice trembling. Jack slammed the crowbar again, teeth clenched, but the lock remained immovable. His arms shook from the effort, and frustration ripped a growl from his throat. Switching tools, he grabbed the bolt cutters and positioned them on the lock. His hands were slick, his grip unsteady, but he clamped down with every ounce of strength his 68-year-old body still possessed. The cutters bit into the corroded metal, squealing in protest. For a terrible moment, Jack feared even these would fail. He pushed harder, his breath coming in gasps. The rain seemed determined to drown them all, hammering on his shoulders and splashing against the cage with relentless force. The shepherd whimpered again, weaker now, his head lowering until it pressed against the bars as if in surrender. His ribs showed clearly through his soaked fur, each shiver of breath a reminder of how little strength remained. Blood streaked his paws where he had scraped them raw trying to claw free, and his body sagged heavily against the iron. Jack felt his resolve harden at the sight. No creature deserved this, not in his town, not in his lifetime. Beside him, Lily had fallen to her knees in the mud, the flashlight balanced in both hands. She whispered softly through the bars, her voice cracking but steady enough to reach the dog's ears. "Hold on, we're here. We won't leave you." The shepherd's eyes flickered, as if her words alone kept a sliver of hope alive inside him. Jack's arms trembled violently as he gave one last push with the cutters. The metal screamed, sparks of rust flying, and then with a loud crack, the padlock split. The broken piece fell into the mud with a dull thud. For a breathless moment, everything went still except for the pounding rain. Then Jack flung the cage door open. The shepherd stumbled forward, collapsing immediately into the mud. His body hit the earth with a heavy sound, too weak to hold himself upright. Jack dropped the tools, rushing to his side, his hands checking the rise and fall of the dog's chest. "Shallow. Too shallow." "Easy, boy," Jack muttered, his voice trembling with relief and fear. "You're out now. You're safe." But the shepherd didn't look at him. His tired eyes searched through the rain until they found Lily. The little girl crawled closer without hesitation, ignoring the mud that soaked her knees and the storm that threatened to swallow them whole. She placed the flashlight carefully on the ground, letting it shine across the shepherd's broken body, and reached out her tiny hands. The dog's head lifted just enough to collapse into her lap, a heavy, trembling weight that nearly knocked her back. Lily gasped softly, then held him as best as her small arms could. She stroked his soaked fur with gentle fingers, whispering again and again, "It's okay now. You're safe. You're safe." The shepherd let out a long, rattling sigh, his entire body melting into her, as though at last he had found the place he was meant to rest. Jack froze at the sight, his throat tightening. The storm raged on, water swirling around their ankles, But for that moment, time seemed to stop. There was no thunder, no fear, no danger, just a little girl kneeling in the mud, cradling a broken creature in her lap, and the bond forming between them stronger than anything Jack could have imagined. The flashlight beam illuminated every raw detail, the dog's ribs protruding with hunger, the bleeding pads of his paws, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Yet in Lily's arms, the shepherd seemed to find strength enough to lift his eyes one more time, gazing at her with something that looked like gratitude. Jack wiped his face, though he wasn't sure if it was rain or tears. The cage behind them creaked as it sank deeper into the ditch, a grim reminder of how close death had been. If Lily hadn't insisted, if Jack had walked away, the shepherd would have been lost forever in that forgotten corner. But because of her, because of the purity of a child's compassion, he was free. Jack placed a steadying hand on his granddaughter's shoulder. "We've got him," he whispered hoarsely. "He's alive because of you." The storm rumbled once more, but its fury no longer mattered. In the middle of the flooded field, a child's love had broken through rust and ruin, and a dying dog had found a reason to hold on. The rain had finally softened into a mist by the time Jack carried the German shepherd back toward the farmhouse. His arms strained under the dog's weight, though the animal was thin and frail. Every few steps, Jack's boots sank deep into the mud, but he refused to slow. Lily walked at his side, one hand clutching the edge of his coat, the other holding the flashlight, its beam bobbing across the dark path. The barn doors groaned as Jack pushed them open with his shoulder, carrying the broken creature inside. The warm glow of the lantern filled the space, bouncing off the wooden beams and stacks of hay. Jack laid the shepherd gently onto a bed of clean straw, his breath ragged from the effort. The dog whimpered once, curling into himself, too weak to rise. His fur was matted with mud, his ribs showing like sharp ridges beneath the skin, his paws raw and bleeding. Jack set down his tools and reached for the old veterinary kit he kept on the shelf, a habit from the days when animals had always needed tending. His hands moved with practiced precision, pulling bandages, clean rags, and a tin of ointment. But when Jack knelt beside the shepherd with the rag, the animal stiffened. His dark eyes darted up, filled with fear, and his body trembled violently. A low growl rumbled in his chest, weak but clear. Jack paused, keeping his movements slow. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "I won't hurt you." But the shepherd's gaze shifted past Jack to the tiny figure standing quietly in the doorway. Lily stepped forward without hesitation, her little boots crunching softly in the straw. The growl faded instantly, replaced by a low whimper. The shepherd's head lifted, his gaze locked on her as though she was the only safe thing in this world. Jack's breath caught at the sight. "Well, I'll be," he whispered. "He only trusts you." The little girl lowered herself onto the straw beside the animal. Her dress was still damp, clinging to her knees, but she didn't care. Slowly, she reached out her tiny hand, resting it on the shepherd's head. His trembling eased almost at once, his eyes closing in a weary kind of surrender. Only then did Jack dare to begin cleaning the wounds, gently wiping the mud from torn pads and matted fur. The dog endured the touch, but his gaze never left Lily. When Jack placed a shallow dish of food nearby, the shepherd only sniffed at it, then turned his head away. His sides rose and fell in stubborn refusal. "He won't eat," Jack muttered, concern lining his brow. "Too scared. Too broken." But Lily stayed still, stroking the shepherd's ear. After a moment, she whispered softly, "I'll stay." She scooted closer, her knees brushing the edge of the dish, her small hand resting on his neck. The shepherd glanced at the food again, then at her, and as if her presence was permission, he lowered his head and began to eat, slowly, cautiously, each bite punctuated by the comfort of her nearness. Jack's chest ached at the sight. He had tended to countless animals in his lifetime, but never had he seen one respond to medicine of the heart so powerfully. It wasn't the food that gave the shepherd strength. It was the trust he found in the eyes of a child. As Jack cleaned further, he discovered marks that spoke of a darker past. Scars etched deep into the fur around the neck, faint lines where a collar had once been pulled too tight. Across his ribs, there were old welts, the kind left not by accident but by cruelty. Jack's jaw clenched. He had seen enough in his career to know the signs of abuse. Whoever had caged this dog had done worse than just neglect him. They had broken him piece by piece. But in that barn, surrounded by straw and the smell of hay, Lily's voice rose softly. She began to hum a lullaby, the kind her mother had sung once upon a time. The melody was fragile, barely more than a whisper, but it carried something older than words: comfort. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound. His eyes softened, the growl gone, his breathing steadying as the small voice filled the silence. He shifted slightly, and for the first time, his tail gave the faintest wag against the straw, weak, tentative, but real. Jack sat back on his heels, his weathered hands resting in his lap. He had antibiotics, salves, and gauze at his disposal, but in that moment, he realized something he had known all along. Healing doesn't always come from medicine. Sometimes it comes from love. Sometimes it comes from the innocence of a child who doesn't see scars, only the soul beneath them. Lily leaned closer, her forehead touching the shepherd's damp fur as she whispered between her lullaby, "You're safe now. Nobody will hurt you here." The shepherd sighed deeply, his body finally relaxing, and with that sigh came a fragile peace that even the storm outside could not disturb. 4 hours they stayed there, Jack working slowly, Lily never leaving the dog's side. When at last the wounds were cleaned and the worst of the mud washed away, the shepherd lay resting, his head still pressed against the girl's lap. The lantern light flickered gently across the scene. An old man kneeling in quiet reverence, a child humming softly, and a broken creature finding, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be loved. Outside, the storm gave way to silence. The town of Willow Brook lay still beneath the stars, unaware of the small miracle taking place in a weathered barn. For while the world might pass by scars and suffering without notice, that night a child had offered something greater than medicine, greater than fear. She had offered love, and love had begun the work of healing. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the little town washed clean but heavy with the scent of wet earth. The fields glistened beneath the pale light, puddles reflecting the broken fences and scattered branches the winds had left behind. Jack opened the barn doors, letting the fresh air seep into the warm, straw-scented space. Inside, the German shepherd stirred weakly, lifting his head when Lily came skipping in. She was carrying a bowl of water with both hands, her small arms shaking under its weight, but her eyes shining with pride. The dog's tail thumped faintly against the straw at the sight of her, a weak but unmistakable sign that trust had begun to take root. Word spread quickly in a town as small as Willow Brook. By mid-morning, neighbors were stopping by, each one carrying a mix of curiosity and outrage. Martha had telephoned a few of the families on the street, and within hours, the barn was filled with familiar faces, farmers with mud still on their boots, mothers holding their children close, older couples shaking their heads in disbelief. Jack explained what they had found, how the cage had been half buried by the storm, how the shepherd had been locked inside with no chance of escape. Each detail drew gasps of horror, followed by murmurs of anger. Who could do such a thing? Mrs. Palmer, the baker's wife, whispered, her hand pressed against her mouth. To lock a living creature in a cage and leave it to die? An old farmer spat into the dirt, his face twisted in disgust. That wasn't an accident. Someone put that cage there. His words hung heavy in the air. The thought that cruelty of such scale had touched their peaceful town left the community shaken. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Harris, arrived not long after. He listened quietly as Jack walked him through the events of the night, from Lily's discovery to the frantic rescue in the storm. Harris examined the cage where it lay half submerged in the ditch. The rust was old, but the chain and padlock were not. He crouched low, running his fingers over the fresh scratches near the lock. "This wasn't forgotten," he muttered grimly. "This was deliberate." He turned to Jack, his eyes narrowing. "Someone put that dog there to die." The news spread like wildfire, and with it came theories. Some whispered of kids playing a cruel prank, but Harris quickly dismissed the idea. Others spoke of darker things, rumors of men who had been seen on the outskirts of town, moving animals in covered trucks, trading them for cash. Willow Brook was small, but not untouched by greed. And now the pieces began to fit. As Jack continued to care for the shepherd, he discovered more clues about the dog's past. Under the scars of abuse, faint patterns of worn fur marked where a heavy collar had once rested, tighter than it ever should have been. His teeth, though still strong, bore the filing marks of crude training. Jack recognized the signs instantly. This dog had once been trained, perhaps even used for guarding or fighting, then abandoned when his worth ran dry. Someone had profited from his pain, and when he could no longer serve their purpose, they had discarded him like trash. The revelation filled the townsfolk with fury. "Trading animals like they're nothing more than coins?" Harris growled. "That's not just cruel. That's criminal." He promised to launch a deeper investigation, to follow the trail of whoever was behind it. But beneath his words was an unspoken warning. Men who dealt in such things rarely stopped easily. In the meantime, the shepherd remained at the barn, his fragile life tethered to the gentle hands of a 4-year-old girl. Every day, Lily came running in with her little boots squeaking against the floorboards. She sang to him, told him stories, pressed her cheek against his coarse fur as though the scars did not exist. When Jack brought food, the dog sniffed it but turned his head until Lily sat beside him. Only when she was close, her small hand resting on his neck, did he lower his muzzle and eat. It was as if her presence alone gave him permission to live. The town took notice. Neighbors who had once shaken their heads now stood in quiet awe as they watched the bond unfold. Mothers whispered to their children about kindness. Old men muttered about how innocence sometimes saw clearer than wisdom. Newspapers in nearby counties picked up the story, their headlines painting Lily as the symbol of compassion in a world too often hardened by fear. Strangers began to visit, bringing blankets, food, and donations for the dog they now called Chance, because he had been given one. But admiration was shadowed by unease. Harris's investigation had uncovered disturbing truths. A local man, known for shady dealings on the edge of town, was suspected of being part of an illegal animal trading ring. Tracks near the ditch matched the tires of his truck. Witnesses recalled seeing him late at night hauling cages. Though no charges had yet been filed, suspicion wrapped tightly around him. And with suspicion came fear. If he had placed the shepherd in that cage once, what was to stop him from returning to finish what he started? At night, Jack double-locked the barn doors. He kept his old rifle propped against the wall, a habit he had not taken up in years. Martha worried, her face lined with concern, but Jack only shook his head. "If they come for him," he said quietly, "they'll have to go through me first." Lily, too young to understand the danger, only clung tighter to her new friend. She named each scar with gentleness, giving them stories instead of sorrow. "This one," she whispered, tracing a line along his shoulder, "means you were brave. And this one here means you fought hard to come home." The shepherd would sigh, his weary eyes closing as if her words carried a balm no medicine could rival. Sometimes, when her voice grew tired, she would hum a lullaby, and his tail would wag just enough to lift the hearts of everyone who saw. In those moments, the town realized something profound. Healing did not come only from doctors or laws or punishments for the guilty. It came from love, the kind of love that children gave freely, without fear or condition. And yet, beneath the warmth of that truth, shadows lingered. The cage had been placed deliberately. A man profited from cruelty, and villains rarely let go of what they consider theirs. So as Willow Brook rallied around Lily and her shepherd, offering blankets and bread, donations and prayers, a question echoed in every heart. Would compassion be enough to keep them safe? Or would those who thrived on suffering return to reclaim the life that had slipped through their fingers? Days turned into weeks, and slowly the scars of the storm began to fade from Willow Brook. Fallen branches were cleared, fences mended, and the roads dried beneath the warmth of the early summer sun. But inside the little barn on Jack's property, another kind of healing was taking place, quiet, steady, and far more miraculous. The German shepherd, once too weak to stand, had begun to walk again. At first his steps were unsteady, his paws trembling under the weight of his own body. But each day he grew a little stronger, fueled not just by food and medicine but by the constant presence of the little girl in the blue dress. Lily never left his side. She rose at dawn to bring him water, sat cross-legged beside him while he ate, and whispered to him as if her words carried the power to knit his wounds together. Wherever she went, he followed, limping at first, then walking with purpose, until before long he was trailing her everywhere, his dark eyes watching her every move like a shadow that refused to leave. For Lily, the bond meant more than anyone could measure. Since her parents' struggles and the silence that had crept into her young life, loneliness had been a constant companion. She had carried it like an invisible weight, a sadness she could not name. But with the shepherd beside her, the loneliness began to dissolve. His steady presence was like a heartbeat in the quiet spaces of her world. He wagged his tail when she giggled, pressed his head into her chest when she cried, and ran clumsily after her when she skipped across the yard. With him, she was never truly alone again. The town noticed. People who had once whispered in hushed tones about the cruelty of the cage now spoke openly about the miracle of the bond. "Have you seen them?" neighbors would ask. "That little girl and her dog? She saved him, and now he saves her right back." It became a story people told each other at the market, in the pews of the old church, and along the dusty lanes. The bond between the child and the shepherd began to spread like a quiet flame, warming hearts that had long grown cold to the world's harshness. One Sunday afternoon, the townsfolk decided to gather at Jack's barn. They came not because anyone asked them to, but because they felt drawn to the story that had touched them all. Families arrived carrying baskets of food, blankets, and tools. Some brought lumber, nails, and hammers. Others brought sacks of grain, jars of honey, and loaves of warm bread. Children clutched handmade cards with drawings of a little girl and her dog, their crayons struggling to capture the depth of what the real thing meant. Jack stood by the barn door, watching in quiet awe as his neighbors moved like a single body. Farmers built a sturdier shelter, hammering planks into place until the barn had an extension fit for the shepherd, a warm, dry corner lined with straw and old quilts. Women spread blankets over the ground, creating a patchwork of comfort. Children crouched low to pet the dog, though always gently, always with a glance at Lily first to see if it was allowed. And Lily, her cheeks glowing pink with shy pride, beamed as she stood beside her shepherd, introducing him as if he were a brother instead of a rescued stray. The shepherd, who once cowered from human hands, now lifted his head high, his ears alert and his tail wagging weakly at every kindness offered. His ribs no longer showed so sharply, his fur grew glossier by the day, and his paws, once bloodied, healed into strength again. But no matter how many people surrounded him, His gaze always returned to Lily. She was his anchor, his reason, his chosen human. And in the town's eyes, that bond was sacred. Someone whispered that Lily was the guardian angel of the shepherd, and the name spread almost instantly. Soon it was on everyone's lips. Old men on porches spoke it with reverence. Children at school repeated it in wide-eyed admiration. Even the local paper ran a headline, "Guardian Angel of Willow Brook, How a Child's Love Saved a Life." The little girl in the blue dress who once wandered quietly through the edges of her town was now seen as a symbol of hope, innocence, and courage. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in shades of gold, the townsfolk gathered again at Jack's farm. This time not just to build, but to celebrate. They shared food, sang old hymns, and watched as Lily and her shepherd played in the grass. The dog, stronger now, chased after her with surprising speed, his ears flopping, his bark echoing across the field like laughter. Lily's giggles carried through the evening air, weaving with the sounds of joy until the barnyard felt like a festival of life reborn. Jack, standing with Martha near the fence, felt tears prick his eyes. He had feared for his granddaughter's heart, afraid her loneliness would silence her spirit forever. But here she was, running free, her laughter returning to the world, her hand always resting on the shepherd's back. Healing had come, not through doctors or time alone, but through a bond so pure it had moved an entire town. The shepherd was no longer just a dog. He was a survivor, a testament to loyalty and resilience. And Lily was no longer just a quiet child. She was the guardian angel of the shepherd, a symbol of compassion that reminded the town of something they had nearly forgotten, that sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest strength, and that love can transform not just a wounded soul, but an entire community. As the lanterns were lit and the townsfolk prepared to leave, the barn glowed like a beacon in the night. Neighbors shook Jack's hand, pressed his shoulder, and thanked him for letting them be part of something bigger than themselves. But Jack only smiled and looked toward the little girl and her dog, sitting together in the grass, the stars beginning to shimmer above them. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "Thank her. She's the reason he's alive. And maybe in saving him, she's saving us all too." In the end, what began with the faint whimper of a trapped dog became a story that changed an entire town. A little girl in a blue dress, with hands so small they could barely hold a flashlight, showed that courage isn't measured by strength, but by compassion. Sometimes, the smallest hands make the biggest difference. The German shepherd, once caged, broken, and forgotten, rose again, not just as a survivor, but as a living symbol of loyalty. His devotion to the child who saved him became a quiet lesson for everyone who watched, that loyalty never fades, even when the world tries to break it. Through Lily's innocence, the town rediscovered a truth it had long forgotten, that healing doesn't come from burying pain or from silence. It comes from love. Her gentle touch and unwavering kindness turned cruelty into hope, sorrow into laughter, and a broken life into something whole again. In her presence, scars became stories of survival, and wounds became proof that compassion has the power to mend even the deepest hurt. The people of Willow Brook will never forget what they witnessed. A little girl reminding them that innocence can heal sorrow, and that one act of love can inspire an entire community. And as the shepherd follows her, step for step, day after day, he stands as a testament to a bond that no cruelty can erase. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in loyalty that never fades. Like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from, because sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones we choose to carry together.